Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their attic. While playing hide and seek, Peppa noticed a peculiar door behind some old boxes that she had never seen before. The door was painted in faded colors that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. George pointed at the door with his tiny finger, making excited dinosaur noises, but something felt different about his voice. It echoed strangely, as if coming from somewhere far away. Peppa reached for the rusty handle, and the moment she touched it, the entire house went silent. The door creaked open to reveal a room that looked exactly like their living room, but everything was wrong. The furniture was the same bright colors, but they seemed to glow with an unnatural light. The family portrait on the wall showed their faces, but their smiles were too wide, stretching beyond what should be possible. Mummy Pig appeared in the doorway, but her usual warm greeting was replaced by a mechanical repetition of the same phrase over and over. Her eyes, normally kind and caring, reflected nothing at all, like looking into empty windows. Daddy Pig sat in his chair reading his newspaper, but the pages were blank. George tugged on Peppa's dress, pointing to the window. Outside, their garden looked the same, but the sky was a strange shade of purple, and the sun hung motionless. The muddy puddles they loved to jump in had turned into perfect black circles that seemed to go down forever. Peppa tried to speak, but her voice came out distorted, like an old recording played backwards. She realized that every time she blinked, the room changed slightly. A chair would move, a picture would tilt, or a shadow would appear where none should exist. The television in the corner flickered to life, showing their own family, but these versions were different. They moved in slow motion, their actions repeating in an endless loop. The Peppa on screen turned to look directly at the real Peppa, and her cartoon smile began to fade into something else entirely. George started crying, but no tears came from his eyes. Instead, the sound of his crying seemed to come from the walls themselves, echoing through the house like a haunting melody. Peppa grabbed his hand and tried to run back through the door, but it had vanished. The room began to spin slowly, and Peppa noticed that their reflections in the mirror were moving independently, waving goodbye as the real Peppa and George stood frozen in place. The last thing Peppa remembered was the sound of familiar laughter, but it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. When Peppa woke up, she was back in her own bed, with George sleeping peacefully beside her. Everything seemed normal, but when she looked in the mirror that morning, her reflection smiled back at her a moment too late. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired on television. This is a different story. It was Monday morning when Peppa woke up excited for school. After breakfast, Daddy Pig drove her to the playgroup. When Peppa arrived at school, something felt different. The playground was unusually quiet, and all her friends were standing perfectly still in a circle. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Candy Cat were there, but they weren't moving. Their smiles seemed wider than usual, stretching unnaturally. Madame Gazelle appeared at the school entrance, ringing her bell. "Time for lessons, children," she announced, but her voice sounded deeper than normal. The children began walking toward the building in perfect synchronization, their feet making no sound. Inside the classroom, Peppa sat at her usual desk, but her friends remained standing around her in the same circle formation. They were all staring at her now, their wide smiles never changing. Madame Gazelle began drawing strange symbols on the blackboard. "Today we will learn about friendship," Madame Gazelle said. "True friendship means we all become the same." Peppa felt uncomfortable. "But I like being different," she said quietly. Suddenly, all her friends turned their heads toward her at exactly the same time. Their smiles grew even wider, and Peppa could see that their teeth had become sharp and pointed. "Join us, Peppa," they said in unison, their voices blending into one eerie sound. The classroom began to change around her. The colorful walls turned gray, and the windows showed only darkness outside. The desks and chairs started melting like wax, but her friends remained perfectly still smiling their terrifying smiles. Peppa tried to run toward the door, but it had disappeared. The walls were closing in, and her friends were slowly moving closer, their arms outstretched. "We want you to be happy like us," they chanted together. Just when Peppa thought she couldn't escape, she heard George calling her name. Her little brother was standing in what used to be the doorway, holding his dinosaur toy. But something was wrong with George too. His eyes were completely black, and his smile was just as wide and unnatural. "Peppa," George said in a voice that didn't sound like his own. "Come play with us." The classroom filled with the sound of children's laughter, but it was cold and hollow. Peppa realized that this wasn't her real school. As the walls continued to close in and her friends reached out with their sharp-toothed smiles, Peppa closed her eyes and wished desperately to go home. When she opened her eyes again, she was back in her bedroom at home. It was still Monday morning, and Mummy Pig was calling her for breakfast. Had it all been a dream? Peppa wasn't sure, but she noticed something that made her heart race. There was mud on her shoes. From that day forward, Peppa was never quite the same. She would sometimes stare off into the distance, and sometimes late at night she could hear laughter.
Peppa-pig, the other George. The morning started strangely. Peppa woke up in her bed. Sunlight slipped through the curtains. Everything seemed normal, but the house was filled with an unnatural silence, the kind you feel before you understand it's wrong. She looked at George's bed, empty. Peppa went downstairs. The kitchen was silent. Cups were on the table, but no steam rose from them. The ladle was resting by the stove. No footsteps, no voices. "George? Mummy? Daddy?" No one answered. She began climbing the stairs again, and then heard a creak from the bedroom. Her heart started beating faster. The door was slightly open. Peppa peeked in and froze. George was lying in bed, blanket neat. He was sleeping deeply, the dinosaur toy beside him. His chest rose and fell. His face looked peaceful, eyes shut. Peppa stepped closer. "George?" she whispered. He didn't respond. "Peppa?" A voice? She turned. George stood in the doorway. Also George, awake, real, staring at her with wide, frightened eyes. "Who is that?" she breathed. He didn't answer, just stared at himself, asleep in the bed. The one in bed began to move, sat up slowly, head tilted slightly to one side. A smile began to stretch across his face, too wide, too long, without blinking, eyes open, far too open. "Who are you?" Peppa shouted. That's George, but it's not him." The sitting George lifted his head. "I woke up," he said. The voice was correct, but somehow misaligned, like a recording slightly out of pitch. The real George took a step back. "He's smiling," he whispered. "He isn't blinking." Peppa grabbed her brother's hoof. They ran. On the walls, photographs, Peppa and George. But now on every photo, two George, one familiar, one slightly taller, always smiling. Downstairs, the windows were dimmed. The house felt tighter. The hallway stretched unnaturally long. Crumbs on the floor Peppa didn't remember. Doors now led to strange rooms. A bathroom without mirrors. A living room with 3 sofas, when there had only ever been one. They locked themselves in the closet. Peppa was trembling. "Say something," she whispered. I don't know who he is," George said. "But I'm real. I remember when you taught me to draw the sun with little rays, and he just lies there and smiles." Peppa nodded. "I know," she whispered. "It's you, the other one." He wasn't breathing. Silence. Then footsteps, light, precise, even. He was behind the door. They could feel him. He didn't knock, didn't speak, he just waited. A shadow appeared under the door, small. Hooves. He crouched, peered through the gap. Too long. Then a voice, software flat, like it was being played back. "Peppa, open the door. We're the same." They escaped through the back, but outside, the street was empty, all the houses shut, the windows fogged, and in every reflection, a shape that looked like George. That evening, Peppa lay in bed, George beside her. They held hooves. You're really you, right?" she asked. George looked at her, smiled, silently, too long, without blinking. Since then, there are 2 George in the house. One plays with her, the other stands in the hallway, sometimes by the mirror, sometimes in the bed. Both of them smile. Peppa is afraid to fall asleep, afraid to wake up, afraid she won't notice when they switch places. because one night one of them leaned toward her ear and whispered, "He's sleeping. You chose wrong."
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Peppa's birthday, and everyone in the family was excited to celebrate. But when Peppa woke up that morning, she noticed something strange about her birthday cards. Each one showed the same date, but the year kept changing backwards. First it was last year, then 2 years ago, then 5 years ago, as if time itself was moving in reverse. Downstairs, the birthday decorations were already up, but they looked faded and old, as if they had been hanging there for decades. The balloons were deflated and gray, and the streamers hung limply from the ceiling like cobwebs. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen preparing the birthday cake, but when Peppa looked closer, she saw that the candles were already melted down to nothing. "Happy birthday, Peppa," said Daddy Pig, but his voice sounded distant and echoing, as if he was speaking from very far away. When Peppa turned to look at him, she noticed that he appeared slightly transparent, like a ghost. George was sitting at the table, but he wasn't moving at all, just staring ahead with a blank expression. The birthday party guests began to arrive, but something was terribly wrong with each of them. Susie Sheep came first, but her wool was completely white, and she moved in slow motion. Pedro Pony arrived next, but he was walking backwards, as if the film of his life was being played in reverse. When it came time to blow out the candles, Peppa discovered that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make them go out. Instead, the flames grew bigger and bigger, casting strange shadows on the walls that moved independently of the people in the room. The shadows seemed to be acting out a different party entirely, one where everyone was crying instead of celebrating. As the party continued, Peppa realized that her friends were repeating the same conversations over and over again. "Happy birthday, Peppa," they would say, then pause for exactly 10 seconds, then say it again. Their movements became more and more mechanical, like wind-up toys that were slowly running down. The birthday cake was brought out, but when Peppa looked at it closely, she saw that it was covered in dust and the frosting had turned gray. When Peppa tried to cut the cake, the knife went right through it as if it wasn't really there. The cake was just an illusion, a memory of birthdays past. The guests began to leave one by one, but instead of walking out the door, they simply faded away like morning mist. First Pedro disappeared, then Susie, then all the others, until only Peppa and her family remained. But even they were becoming less solid, less real with each passing moment. Peppa ran to the window to look outside, but instead of the familiar garden, she saw an endless gray void. There were no trees, no grass, no sky, just emptiness stretching on forever. She realized that she wasn't in her real house anymore, but trapped in some kind of memory or dream of a birthday that had never actually happened. As the last of the decorations faded away and the room became completely empty, Peppa heard a voice whisper, "Every birthday is the same birthday, Peppa. You can never grow older here." She looked in the mirror and saw that she looked exactly the same as she always had, and she understood that in this place, she would remain forever young, forever celebrating the same birthday that would never end.
A lost Peppa Pig episode that never aired on TV. Evening descended upon Peppa Pig's house, bringing with it an unusually strong wind. It howled in the chimneys, rattled the shutters, and rustled the leaves of the trees outside the window. Peppa and George were already in their beds, but they couldn't sleep. The wind sounded different than usual. In its howls, strange, almost melodic notes could be heard, and sometimes it seemed to whisper. Peppa listened intently. The whisper became clearer and clearer. It called her name. A quiet, drawn-out voice that seemed to penetrate through the walls. George, lying nearby, stirred. He heard it too. His small eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. The whisper began to tell a story about the wind that was once something else, something that lived in the air but had no form, something that was looking for a home. And now it had found it. The whisper grew closer, as if the wind was entering the room. A cold, invisible current of air touched Peppa's face. She felt her hair stand on end. From outside the window, through the cracks in the frame, thin, almost transparent threads began to seep in. They looked like cobwebs, but moved with incredible speed, writhing and intertwining. The threads slowly stretched towards George. He tried to turn away, but the threads had already enveloped him. They were cold and sticky, like mist, yet strong as steel. The threads began to pull George towards the window. He couldn't resist. His body slowly lifted above the bed, as if an invisible force was pulling him. From outside the window, a quiet but triumphant sigh of the wind was heard. George disappeared out the window, dissolving into the darkness and the howling wind. The threads vanished with him. The wind died down. The room fell silent. Peppa lay there, her heart pounding. She had seen George disappear. She knew he was gone forever. She slowly got out of bed and went to the window. Beyond it was only darkness and the rustling of leaves. But Peppa knew the wind had changed. It had taken George. When Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig came in the morning, they saw Peppa sitting by the window. She was pale and silent. They asked where George was, but Peppa couldn't answer. She just stared at the window, which now seemed so innocent. Her parents decided George had simply run off to play with friends, and Peppa was too tired to speak. Since then, Peppa never opens the windows in her room. She is afraid of the wind, and sometimes, in the silence of the night, she hears a quiet whisper coming from outside the window. It's the mysterious whisper of the wind. It waits for someone to forget it, waits for someone to open the window again. Because the mysterious whisper of the wind never stops. It just waits for someone to forget it.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom. But something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed in her favorite red dress, she noticed her reflection in the mirror was smiling even when she wasn't. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa entered the kitchen, Mummy Pig turned around with a smile that stretched too wide across her face, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than before. "Good morning, Peppa," she said in a voice that sounded hollow and distant. George was already at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his toy dinosaur as usual. Instead, he sat perfectly still, staring at his cereal bowl with eyes that had turned completely black. When Peppa tried to talk to him, he slowly turned his head toward her, and his mouth opened to reveal the same unnaturally sharp teeth as Mummy Pig. Daddy Pig came down the stairs, but his footsteps sounded different, heavier, more deliberate. His glasses reflected no light, and behind them, his eyes were just empty dark holes. "Time for school, Peppa," he announced, but his voice echoed as if coming from somewhere far away. The walk to school felt longer than usual. The familiar houses along the way looked the same, but all the windows were dark, and no other families were outside. The playground equipment stood motionless in the still air, and even the birds had stopped singing. When they reached the school, all of Peppa's friends were already there, standing in a perfect line. Susie Sheep, Rebecca Rabbit, Pedro Pony, and all the others turned to look at Peppa simultaneously. Their eyes had the same black emptiness as George's, and their smiles revealed rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. "We've been waiting for you, Peppa," they said in unison, their voices creating a disturbing harmony. Inside the classroom, Madame Gazelle was writing on the blackboard, but the words kept changing every time Peppa looked away. The lesson seemed to go on forever, and whenever Peppa tried to look out the window, she saw only darkness, as if the world outside had simply disappeared. During playtime, the children gathered around Peppa in a circle. They began to chant something in a language she didn't understand, and with each word, their eyes grew darker and their smiles grew wider. The playground began to spin around her, faster and faster, until everything became a blur of twisted faces and sharp teeth. When Peppa finally made it home, the house looked exactly the same from the outside, but when she opened the front door, she found herself back in the classroom. No matter which door she tried, she always ended up in the same place, surrounded by the same circle of friends with their black eyes and sharp smiles, chanting words that made her feel cold and afraid. The chanting grew louder and louder until it was all Peppa could hear, and she realized that she was beginning to smile the same wide, sharp smile as everyone else. Her reflection in the classroom window showed her own eyes turning black, and she understood that she would never leave this place, never escape the endless circle of friends who had been waiting for her all along.